You might remember the Victorian Government's big housing build. I've banged on about it a few times in the past couple of years. It was the one with the big announcement, along with the big dollar figure attached.
Victoria's big housing build.
$5.3 billion allocated for 12,000 new social housing units.
But for all the spin surrounding the program, the big housing build seems to be coming up pretty short. Dump day. It's become a not-so-proud tradition from the Victorian Government. And keeping with tradition, Jacinta Allen's government dumped over 170 documents, many of them annual reports, tabling them in Parliament just before what is, for many Victorians, a de facto extended long weekend, courtesy of the Melbourne Cup. If you're unfamiliar with Dump Day, I've done a video on it before you can check out here. With Dump Day, essentially the government's objective is to release all the documents that they're required to release on the same day, usually in the lead up to a weekend or a long weekend, in order to give journos the least amount of time possible to trawl through them and dig out the bad news stories before the news cycles had time to move on. There's bonus points if you're able to line it up with a major event like Melbourne Cup or an AFL Grand Final, when there's plenty of competition for the front page, even if a sleep-deprived journo was able to uncover something juicy and report on it ahead of their deadlines. Anyway, we usually have to wait for Dump Day to find out how much social housing there is in Victoria, and given it's been 4 years since the big announcement and billions of dollars have been spent, this is our chance to see how much the big housing build has actually shifted the dial when it comes to social housing in Victoria. Another quick recap for those not familiar with Victoria's big housing build: it was a big announcement from Daniel Andrews just over 4 years ago. $5.3 billion allocated to construct more than 12,000 new homes, a package that was supposed to boost the state's social housing supply by 10% over 4 years.
Our big housing build, $5.3 billion in new money provided in last year's budget. That's on top of more than $1 billion that we'd already committed to invest, both in terms of maintenance and new build at the election in 2018. This is more than 12,000 extra units, so new units, an increase of 10% fully on the total social and affordable and public housing stock, if you like. This is about making sure that vulnerable Victorians have got a home, that we create jobs. That $5.3 billion is good for 10,000 jobs each year, every year, over the life of this program. This is more money than has been spent by any government, state or federal, in the history of our nation to boost public, social and affordable housing.
So for those playing along at home, the budget allocated to Victoria's big housing build over 4 years was twice as much as the federal government will disperse out of the Housing Australia Future Fund over the course of 5 years. Just thought that was an interesting little nugget. Anyway, last time I looked at the numbers, I'd said that the Victorian government would have been hoping that their big housing build was going to come home with a wet sail. Well, it didn't. Not a wet sail. Moist at best.
Never say that again.
At the end of the 2019-2020 financial year, there were 85,111 social housing dwellings in Victoria. At the end of the 2023-24 financial year, there were 89,501. That's an increase of 4,390 social housing dwellings, or an approximate 5% increase on Victoria's social housing stock. So rather than boosting social housing by 10%, they've come in at 5%. Although it should still be pointed out, though, that by all reports, the work still continues.
Flashback.
Essentially, Homes Victoria have acknowledged that they're 3 years behind schedule, but also that in order to deliver the promised 12,000 homes within the $5.3 billion budget, they'll need to reduce the number of homes they build themselves on publicly owned land and instead increase the number built and managed by various community housing providers. Rather than prioritise public land for social housing, the Victorian Government has developed a nasty habit of selling it off to private developers instead.
Let's get back to the present.
We're at 5%. Still, a 5% increase is better than nothing, right? Geez, I hate that saying. It's right up there with, just be grateful you've got anything at all, I guess. Anyway, you may or may not remember that back when the big housing build was announced, there were a few voices calling out the fact that despite its big title, the big housing build, if successful, was still not going to be enough to bring Victoria up to the national average when it came to the proportion of social housing. So with the big housing build delivering around half as much housing as expected to date, Victoria obviously continues to lag behind the rest of the country when it comes to social housing. And that fact's no more clearly highlighted than by another line item in the Department of Fairness, Families and Housing annual report. Well, two line items really, both relating to the average waiting time for public rental housing. The first is the average waiting time for public rental housing for those clients who have received priority access to housing allocation or transfer. This wait time has blown out between the announcement of the big housing build and where we're at today. The average wait time was 12 months in 2019-2020, compared to 19.8 months in 2023-24. The average wait time for public rental housing for those clients who have received priority access to housing allocation or transfer due to family violence has effectively doubled. In my opinion, the wait time was already unacceptably high, 9.9 months in 2019-20, but now it's 19.5 months in 2023-24. To me, that's kind of mind-blowing, and honestly, I can't really begin to imagine what it's like for someone that's trapped in that sort of situation, waiting that long. It's pretty shocking. As the government continues to sell off public land to private developers, the social housing problem in Victoria just gets bigger and bigger. And to be honest, it's a problem that looks set to explode with the demolition of the public housing towers within inner city Melbourne. It almost looks like the Victorian Government will be pulling down or selling off social housing faster than they're going to be building it. And I think people should find that a little concerning. We haven't even really talked about population growth. According to the ABS, the Victorian population stood at just over 6.6 million in 2020. In March of this year, it was just a nudge under 7 million. So the Victorian population's grown by approximately 5.2%, whilst over a similar time period, the state's public housing stock has grown by approximately 5.1%. This too, when the wait times for social housing have blown out, as have the number of people on the waiting list. All due, I would guess, thanks to
a high cost of living.
According to the Vargo audit released in June 2024, the waiting list has ballooned out to over 60,000 households sitting on the social housing waiting list. That's households, not people. But Victoria's underinvestment in social housing really stands out when you look at a longer time period. Victoria has had a long track record of underspending when it comes to social housing. When you allow a problem to fester thanks to chronic underinvestment, it can be easy for a big dollar figure to get quickly swallowed up without making much of a dent in the problem. And that's exactly what we've seen from the big housing build. Since 2013-14, the number of social housing dwellings in Victoria have only grown by 5%. Over that same time period, the state's population's grown by 20.5%. Years of chronic underinvestment led to Victoria falling well behind, meaning they've had to sink in billions of dollars just to not even really tread water.
If the government were to commit a big housing build commitment every 18 months, we would be able to get out of the crisis that we are currently in.
Look, maybe it's fantasyland stuff, hoping that governments will get their hands dirty and start building public housing in the way that they used to, rather than just forking out cash to prop up the profits of private investment. Here's hoping. When you look at the scale of the problem in Victoria and the nation more broadly, it's clear that solutions governments are putting forward are nowhere near ambitious enough. I know a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step and all that, but geez, if you sit down to take a break every couple of metres, that journey is going to take forever.